So our first poet is Ailbhe Darcy. Ailbhe was born in Dublin and brought up there. I thought she currently lives in Indiana, but she's well ahead of us, and she currently lives in Germany. So she's on the move. She has published her poetry in Ireland, Britain and the US, and co-edits Moloch, an online magazine of new art and writing. Selections of her work are included in the Bloodaxe anthologies Identity Parade and Voice Recognition, and in her pamphlet A Fictional Dress, which was published in 2009 with Tall Lighthouse Press. Imaginary Menagerie was published by Bloodaxe Books in 2011, and what a terrific book. It was her first book-length collection, and it was shortlisted for the Strong Award after it came out. And it's my pleasure to welcome Ailbhe to Cork. Our second poet tonight is Caitríona O Reilly. Caitríona was born in Dublin, grew up in Wicklow and Dublin, and now lives in Lincoln, I'm sure. Her first collection, The Nowhere Birds, was shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best First Collection in 2001, and won the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature in 2002. Her second collection, The Sea Cabinet, published in 2006, was a Poetry Book Society recommendation and was shortlisted for the Irish Times Poetry Now Award in 2007. Her third and most recent collection, Geis, was just published last year and is again a Poetry Book Society recommendation and is shortlisted for the Irish Times Poetry Now Award this year. She is a freelance writer and critic and has edited several issues of Poetry Ireland Review and the Irish Poetry Journal Meter. So, Ailbhe and Caitríona.
Cockroaches need just two facts about a place: how dark and how many cockroaches. Or possibly just one fact, the latter. A cockroach was the first of us to give birth in space. Cockroaches can be fooled by cockroach-scented robots into going somewhere bright where the mind gluts blue. When the robot had his mind erased, blue screen, blank tape, he trampled the cockroach, but the cockroach didn't complain. Robots' legs are modelled on cockroaches. The robot takes the scraps we've left behind. He squeeze boxes them into building blocks. He's building a city, an ode to the city that isn't. Question: my son wants to know what happened to the city. Answer: the summer of 2003, Europe was a fever of heat. The old died, the young fled the cities. I knew this girl, so we took off for Nice, rented a room for next nothing. What we got was an addle of roaches. I pulled my legs up on the chair, cockroaches waltzing beneath. Come morning after morning, I took off for blue. I swam until the city was gone, then I floated. Good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm sure you're all just as excited as I am about being here, so I will start by thanking Patrick Cotter and Jen Matthews for inviting me and for organising this incredible thing. And thank you, Leanne, for the generous introduction as well. It is, of course, a particular honour to be the warm-up act for Caitríona O Reilly, who's someone I've looked up to for a long time. And one thing there is to find in her poetry is a keen attention to the strange and fantastic life forms that share not just our planet, but our stories and our histories and our dreams and our very sense of self. And this attention is of importance to the poems that I'm writing at the moment, because these poems come out of 6 years that I spent in Midwestern America, which is a place where nature seems always on the verge of taking over, taking back any land that's been cultivated or built on. And in America, I also gave birth to a child, which for me was an experience of having my space invaded by nature. It felt almost like an infestation. So let me read you one of these poems, and this is called After My Son Was Born. After my son was born, I'd a snip cut in his tongue. Blood scissored down his chin. At every squall, I'd been unsnibbing myself and starving him. He knocked me so my nose coughed blood, punched a finger through my cornea. Blood blubbed on my nipple where his gums met. On the radio, somebody was saying something about Syria. My son jerked knots of hair from my head, tears dashed off his fontanelle. He'd fixed my hips so my clothes didn't fit. I blundered him once against the door jamb. Blood. I bit his father when we were younger, drinking harder, made blood come then. Twice I tried to leave him screaming, 20 minutes at a time, but couldn't keep stum. One breakfast I broke the mug that insisted, don't mess with Texas, smashed it. And all the time I smiled so much my teeth dried. He made everything heavy. Like they say the bomb did for a while. So that Americans swam through their homes, eyes peeled, picking up everyday things and dropping them, as though they were violated with light and pain, as though blood hadn't always been there, waiting. I have a little tradition that whenever I'm asked to read somewhere, I always read a poem by someone else. It seems a way of passing on the good fortune and opening up the stage to others. So I want to read you a poem by Owen Walls today. And this is from his book, which you may know, The Salt Harvest. And if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. He's a poet that I really rate. So this is Bird Strike by Owen Walls. Bird Strike. Blue eyes at the moment, but your resting colour is yet undefined on our airport drive, as we unsettle a murder of rooks from the roadside. Brown or rusted copper. You reach for their flight through the window, clutching and unclutching your hands as if groping through a feather pillow to find the body of a bird. You are restless. You were restless last night and will suckle and struggle in takeoff, new to both earache and flight, until we are caught in the all-coloured, unblinking eye of the sun. I pray against bird strike. I have an idea why seagulls and pigeons nosedive the engines, shredding steel fans with their hollow bird bones, lost in an instant of red mist to claim the airways for their own. But I want you to live. I want you to defy me, bold and upright, staring out from a torrent of feathers in the wake of a pillow fight, brazen in your future. So I think of US Airways Flight 1549, both engines snagging on snow geese on the takeoff for North Carolina, as the pilot skimmed down on the icy Hudson, where his passengers and crew were lifted alive from the water. His eyes were a turbine of blue. In America, I lived in a part of town that was mostly populated by Americans who, because of their race, were treated like second-class citizens. And now in Germany, I live in a suburb with a large population of refugees. In my German class, I'm the only student who isn't a refugee. And this is in a city that's making a really big show of being welcoming, but is of course still figuring out its position and what position to give these new citizens. So all of this is going on in my immediate world, and like everybody lately, I've been thinking a lot about how we claim possession of a space and call some of those who enter it invaders, and how we measure the distance and the difference between ourselves and others. So these next two poems are partly about that. A guided tour of the house and its environs. This is where the floor slants. You can roll a ball. This is where I killed the ants with cleaning chemicals. This tortuous shape represents a salamander. Squeeze the distance and it grows. It shrinks when we leave it alone. This is where you froze the mouse you'd half killed. This is where you'll lie down again, with me. I love your boy shape. I love mantle tree. Nobody needs more zombies, though. Let's not put zombies in the book. These are the crows, which gather on the trees around the house. One tree is the tree I imagine swimming in, when I drink too much and sit on the stoop with you and Michael, or the night I threw the table. As though everything in America had wings, this is where we put the sleeping baby down for the first time, still in the car seat, and watched him. They asked Stein what she thought of the atomic bomb. Miss Stein, what do you think of the atomic bomb? Or she said they did, because she was thinking of it. This is where I watch the snow falling, this window and then this window, on the one hand and then the other. This way you can count to any number. Later, much later, vitamins will erase the dark circles, restore the chalk moons. When we woke, sometimes it was the yellow school bus, already rumbling children home for lunch, that late. Or it was the warning howl of the freight train not stopping for anyone, that early. The buses looked more like buses than buses I'd seen. If the river was high, things would be expensive, low, cheap. Lake effect snow that Christmas Eve, and a mad dash for sherry. This is our photograph of Abraham Lincoln. This is a painting my sister made. Here is the beef we ate for the iron. We have been invited to a wedding in Austin. Here is the deck the landlord built. Here is our herb garden. Here is my bicycle. You bought a waffle iron. To be honest, I usually care quite a lot about the reader, but today I just want to get the whole thing down on paper. Maybe even the music we listen to on the way to the hospital, even how I hate the way Americans say brava to women. This is where I entered text into boxes, which sent it great distances. This is where we dismantled America before getting back into bed together. If we couldn't have it, we said, nobody could. This poem's called Animal Biscuits, and it has an epigraph from Sherman Alexie, the writer, who said that September the 11th changed him by revealing the end game of tribalism, that when you become so identified with only one thing, one tribe, other people become metaphors to you. Animal biscuits. In the photograph, you flaunt all your teeth, to signal you are not grown unwholesome by the violence you do in the photograph. You are hazing an Iraqi, working towards the fur, behaving as animals, violently absent from your own photograph. When they took your picture to court, they constrained it in a chained iron case, digital, weighty, flanked by blank doormen. Still, every morning here on Colfax, a squirrel spills out of a tree onto gravel to wrench me awake. Red. Not as the breast of the figure for bird on a peaceably secular Christmas card. Not a scarlet alpha forcibly worked onto a fictional dress. Not the only colour in a black and white film about war. Not even the real red dress, belted, brief, minatory, my daughter starved herself a week to wear. Not stripes, not love, not blood, a squirrel will always jump clear. And now there is a constellation of photographs, describing an animal we cannot dub archer or bear, a creature we may not tame with metaphor, since metaphor got us into this mess. But Alice is baking biscuits. She has eyes like animals. Her hands do not shake. Biscuits with nuts in, biscuits with butter, each careful measure of what Alice adds. I was reading an old New Yorker on the plane yesterday, and there was a short story in it by Lauren Groff about a woman who, when she becomes a mother, discovers that she's the kind of mother that shouts a lot. And so instead of putting the children to bed, she leaves that to her husband, and she goes out for these long walks in the evening around the neighbourhood, and she looks into the lit up windows of the neighbours, and what she sees, among other things, is all the other mothers. And she writes, I see the mothers I know in glimpses, bent like shepherdess crooks, scanning the floor for tiny Legos or half-chewed grapes, or the people they once were, slumped in corners. And that's how it can be. It made me think of that old saw that a married couple shouldn't be two people standing looking at each other. They should be standing side by side, looking out into the world. But in real life, you're this two bent people looking down at the ground for Lego bricks the whole time and sometimes bumping into each other. So that's how it can be, that's how it can feel. And after my son was born, that's how it felt for me. I didn't sleep at night very much for a long time, and I felt like I didn't get away for an eternity. And then one day, I did get away. And I went to the local art museum, and I saw this exhibition of photographs by Ansel Adams of America. And so I wrote this poem, which is Ansel Adams' Aspens. Ansel Adams' Aspens. To tiny Ansel Adams, newly arrived on this earth, the sky must seem a miracle. I'd commit the scene to black and white if I could. The sky bright and bottomless, trees gnarled as the knees of elephants. Helpless in his built-right pram, Ansel Adams is watching the clouds roll in. Then the clouds would gather speed, roll out again. And the camera panned down to Ansel Adams, the man, kneeling on granite, choosing one filter over another. It's as though more and greater apparatus were needed to recapture that first exposure, says the voiceover. As though Ansel Adams were a pioneer, toiling after the spirit, not just the body of America. To tiny Ansel Adams, newly arrived on this earth, the sky must seem a matter of fact. It's the mind beneath he wants to grasp, stowed in its smart black enclosure. I'd have his pram gather speed and transform, a cartoon robot against the heavens, wheels spinning into Ansel Adams' camera. Now the bright black sky is Ansel Adams, and Ansel Adams the filter. Light renders each tree a bouquet of paper. The Great Depression gathers like so much weather. To tiny Ansel Adams, newly arrived on this earth, the sky is what it is, taut with its isness. Sometime before dawn, the section framed by in here blackens and brightens, and each tree out there glows with itself, with the certainty of all Ansel Adams' aspens. No one is watching, but this one bewildered immigrant, toiling after sleep, saturated in monochrome. Sometimes it's all you'll find in the wilderness. Ansel Adams, tiny in his pram, composing the day just gone. Okay, I'll read you two more poems and then I'm done. The first of these poems is about silverfish, which, in case some of you have the privilege not to know, are these insects that you find in your bathroom, or at least I find in my bathroom. And they're not the most adorable creatures, but then neither are we. And like us, they do have one redeeming quality, which in their case is a beautiful mating ritual, which involves dancing and waiting and a hot pursuit. Silver. I need silverfish. Rise cold at night to cold cock silverfish. I get a kick from electric lighting up their hood. My husband stomps them with his hand shoes. I haven't asked him if what comes is dust, and he wouldn't tell me if I did. They've never had the vote. I tell them once my mum spilled mercury from a thermometer, bowled it futuristically. She wanted me to think her girlhood full of mercury and pencil leads, gouged into the bowls of hands of sisters begging for their sisterhood. She said that where my father worked, the walls were still thick with asbestos. And since my husband's terrified of poisoning our son, our bathroom is a fish moth farm, cracks spilling silverfish onto infinite white. They cannot climb. They fear the light. I've learned the love of silverfish has 3 parts. For first, the silverfish stand face to face. Antennae quiver. They back off and come back. They think of Roald Dahl, pressing foil on foil to make a silver ball. Patience is a thumbnail scoring metal, ironing paper flat. Then the male makes a dash for it, the female dashes after. And when the doctor dashed my son at me, I could swear he was silver. Purple maybe, but silver gilded. Not a son then, but a monster. What I remember is gasping and fighting while my husband fought to sever the cord, jumping and looping that held us together. For thirds, the silver fish are side by side and head to tail, the male stroking her. What he gives is wrapped in gossamer. And now, here our silverfish hordes are, gobbling our discarded skin and hair, and that is parenthood. The first silver I found was long before, a slim string among the hair issuing from my husband's chest. We were dirt young then, and I yanked it, threw it to the silverfish. Thank you for listening. This last poem is about knotweed, which is an invasive species, so it is in conversation maybe with Paul Casey's poem about kudzu last night. Knotweed is a plant that in some places gardeners fear it's going to take over completely and smother us all to death, but then in other contexts it's much appreciated and even beloved as the plant that outlives the gardener. Thank you again for listening. This is Still, and it's dedicated to the British poet Denise Riley. Still. There's a picture in your head instead of someone else's. You could hang it. The still of that smallness, indefinite and keen. An adult's hand, stern as a wristwatch, holding a child in time. Then it was not night. Here on the porch, threatened by knotweed and all the resources of artificial light. An adult can hold a child like that and not mean cruelty. Just holding on to someone small who's frightened, inclined to move suddenly. How good that feels, a heat in it, a handful of sugar thrown on the fire. The tricks we possess, simply having lived here longer, and knotweed makes a good mother, repetitive. The still of that smallness, here on the porch. Don't we lose every child in the end? No, we don't. Today I meant to be writing about the weather. I mean, I take a lot for granted, like there will always be a metaphor. But knotweed is the same every time, is nothing like words. I mean, to teach my son self-defense, outdoorsy skills, how to be a survivor. It occurred to me you might have hurt him, holding on so tight, stilling a child who meant only to be moving. But everything we husband is always shedding. Everything has tread. We want to say some things are unnameable, or some names are unspeakable, but we are well capable of words. I've been learning about knotweed this weather. Knotweed just happens in my head. Knotweed which spreads, makes the whole world similar, less tangled, with shoots that taste like rhubarb, only better. Before this, I was a small person, and a big person held me. Still, I was frightened. I wanted to know what would happen. I was moving, and I wanted to be held.
I see there's a clock. This is for timekeeping purposes. I'm not expecting a pause during the reading, but there is already a clock, which is good. It's a very great pleasure to be in Cork. Any excuse to come to Cork is always great, and it's a great pleasure to be reading here with Ailbhe. And thank you to Pat and Jen also for inviting me. I'm going to read just from my latest book, which is called Geis. And I'll start with the first poem in the collection, which is a poem really about the sort of the pleasure of language, really, the intoxication of language and the great thrill, which is what all poets feel. And it's a poem, I went through a period of about 4 or 5 years where I didn't write any poetry at all. And this poem was kind of written before that period, and it served as a kind of reminder to me about how enjoyable it can be. It's also the result of just reading through the O section of the dictionary, which I used to do. I find it quite sad now that everything is on a screen and you can't just leaf through the dictionary at random. I think that sort of narrows your options somewhat, has been my experience. This is called Ovum. You take it for 0 or nothing, or the spotless oval your lips make saying it, as if you blew both yolk and albumen through its pin-pricked head, the meat of the word made orotund and Latinate. It's like putting your mouth to the smooth breast of the ocarina from Oca, the goose, hooting out its fledgling notes. Unless you seal the gap it's left, they'll fall out, those other O words, like bubbles streaming through a soapy blowhole, from oblation and obloquy to oxlip and ozone, and that sneaky Trojan obol, coin-shaped, it's true, but spawned from the spiky Greek of obolus, the death mark, dagger or crucifix, as phallic and obvious now that you say it, as that double O in spermatozoon, which enters by its own locomotion, the flagellum, its tiny whip and scourge. I suppose that's a poem about the sperm words and the egg words and the zygote of the poem that results. And that's often the way, you know, one thing dovetails with another and then this sort of third entity emerges. Counter to that poem, I'm going to read a poem now about silence, I suppose, which is obviously a paradox. We don't really get snow now. I live in the east of England, and for the first few years I was there we had snow, and we don't get it now, and I miss it. I miss silence. It's the sense of a kind of dampening, almost like the dampeners on piano strings coming down and just making everything very, very quiet. And a poet tries to smear this silence with words on some level. So I tried to capture that paradox in this short poem. Snow. What is it to talk about silence? When I look up from my table, it will still be there, where it fell in the night, hurrying to congregate in the cone cast by the street lamp, and in the darkness the others, unseen but legion. How bruise blew the shadows on the garden, and the frozen cobwebs snapped beneath their weight. In the park we blundered across it, the quiet, in spite of its exclamatory outline on bare trees, down great hushed halls of white, and the white lake picked out in kanji by the moorhen's feet. Are there words for what I felt in the faceted garden? Motes, corpuscles, animalcules. And it is a relief to feel it touch me with its meaning, its vast, multitudinous silence, again and again. There are several poems in this collection, I guess, which are northern in orientation, and this next poem is one of them. This poem is the result of having received a mail shot from Greenpeace, with a very distressing photograph of a polar bear which had died of starvation and exhaustion from having its habitat melted and having to swim vast distances to feed. And I felt very impotent and very angry, and this is a poem that resulted really from anger. There's a reference in the poem to the Chukchi. Chukchi are one of the First Nations around the Arctic Circle, and they occasionally would hunt a polar bear, and they would have various elaborate rituals for dealing with the skull of the polar bear. They would always bury it facing north. And also, it's I always think interesting to bear in mind the fact that the Greek word for bear, I think, is arcturus. So the Arctic is basically the place of the bear, and this poem was really written as a kind of attempt to capture a genius loci, I suppose. It's called Polar, and there's a short epigraph. The US Geological Survey predicts 2/3 of the world's polar bears will disappear by 2050. By means of this, the photon is deflected into darkness, our white heat leaking from us. A great absconded god of emptiness hunted the groaning flows, scattering waves and particles from his coat, his hair hollow as birds' bones. Intervals of immense, glittering distance. Then the animal heat of fur, of blood and membrane, and hot breath, the black-tongued breath of the sea. He tasted the breath of whales, he haunted the boundaries, ice rim and earth rim, the whetstone sky on which sense sharpened, on which his breath hung its own strange statues. Mage of the edge, who knew his material in all its aspects, this yearly raising of dense liquid to frazzle, nihilus and pack ice, its boundless transformations. Always he was equal to the whiteness of his kingdom, totem and Newman, to a universe now present, now absent. Who will bury him like the Chukchi, his huge head indicating true north, amid libations and the pouring out of oil? Involved in a situation that he couldn't extricate himself from, so his style was dripping, was action painting, and a prominent critic, which really annoyed him, called him Jack the Dripper. So he had become really well known for this style of painting, and he couldn't really find a way out back into figurative art at all, and he felt, I think, very trapped by it. He had a very troubled background, and he had a terrible drink problem. So he was a man who was very trapped by his own hype, I suppose. And it struck me that there's a big parallel between him and Donald Crowhurst. And I don't know if you're familiar with Donald Crowhurst. He was a yachtsman, a British yachtsman, who was involved in the first round-the-world challenge, single-handed yacht race around the world, which was, I think, in 1969. And Donald Crowhurst was a weekend sailor. He was a businessman. He was a very kind of upbeat kind of chap, happily married, he had 4 children, and he decided that he was going to enter this round-the-world race with very, very experienced sailors, and he would build a catamaran. So he got local businessmen to sponsor him. He mortgaged his house, and he built a catamaran. And basically he was in up to his neck, and he couldn't get out of it. And he left, he took part in the challenge, and the very last day he could legally leave, which was in October. And by the time he got to the Azores, he realised he wouldn't go around the Horn and survive. But, you know, he'd mortgaged his house, he'd gotten all sorts of people involved. So what he thought he would do was he would fake his logbooks, and he would sail up and down the coast of Brazil. He would drop out of the race, and then when everybody else came round and sailed up the South Atlantic, he'd just slot in behind them. And, you know, if he came last, it wouldn't really matter very much. But what happened, in fact, was that he did this, so he sailed down the coast of Brazil, and then the other people came along. One person dropped out, another person came cropper, and then he found himself in the bizarre position of coming in first. And he knew that his logbooks would be subject to scrutiny, and that he would be exposed as a fraud, and his family would lose their home, and he would lose absolutely everything. And what happened seemed to be that he went mad. They found the yacht, the Tenth Electron, drifting with nobody on it. He'd taken the chronometer from board and just stepped off. And they found his logbooks and his diaries, which show a kind of insanity. So, Jackson Pollock. It doesn't seem to make much sense, but it just struck me that there were kind of bizarre parallels between the two of them in terms of getting into something that you can't get out of. So this is Blue Poles, which is a very short poem after that long ramble. Blue Poles is a painting by Jackson Pollock, which is in Australia, I think, one of his last major canvases. Blue Poles, after Jackson Pollock. Freedom is a prison for the representative savant, addled on bathtub gin and with retinas inflamed from too long staring into the Arizona sun, or into red dirt which acknowledges no master but the attrition of desert winds and meltwater. Is that why you cast such desperate lariats across space, repeatedly anticipating the fall into disillusion, the sine wave skewered by the oscilloscope, the mirror's hairline fracture? The West was won, and there was nowhere left to go. So you vanished into a dream of perpetual motion, knowing that once to touch the surface was to break the spell, but that while the colours hung on the air an instant, there was no such thing as the pushy midwife, the veiled mother in the photograph, the rich woman's bleated blandishments. Tracing the drunken white line at midnight on the highway, you were too far gone to contemplate return, like Crowhurst aboard the Electron, not meaning to go to sea, but drawing about you such a field of force that there was nothing left to do but plant blue poles amongst the spindrift and iron filings, and step, clutching your brass chronometer, clean off the deck and into the sky, where a lens rose to meet you like a terrifying eye. The last line of that poem refers to a famous scene where Pollock was filmed over a sheet of perspex, very like this, and the cameraman was kind of sitting underneath with the camera pointing upwards, and Pollock was sort of dripping onto the perspex, and he felt he'd sort of sold his soul, I think, at that point, and that was kind of the finish of him.